Israel, Iran and the US have all had their say at an emergency UN Security Council meeting in New York this morning. Iran requested the meeting following the US bombing three of its nuclear sites yesterday. Iran's ambassador to the UN says Israel and the United States have destroyed the diplomatic path to peace. However, Israel's UN envoy says Iran used negotiations as camouflage to buy time to build missiles and enrich uranium, and the cost of inaction would have been catastrophic. Geoffrey Miller is a geopolitical analyst and is researching his PhD on New Zealand's relations with the Gulf states. Geoffrey is with us now. Tēnā koe. How significant was that meeting this morning?
Good afternoon, Charlotte. Look, it was pretty much as we would expect from a Security Council meeting after the events that we've seen at the weekend. Russia and China condemned the US strikes. You heard in your introduction there what the Iranian ambassador said, what the Israeli ambassador said. I don't think anything was said there that was unexpected, but it's still useful to have it all on the record.
So it was largely just talking?
Well, look, there's always an element of, there's always a performative element at these Security Council meetings. It doesn't mean they're valueless. And I think when you look at what the UN Secretary General said, Antonio Guterres, he warned of another cycle of destruction and said it was a perilous turn, what we saw over the weekend with these US strikes on Iran. And it's difficult to disagree with that assessment.
What needs to happen next after this council meeting? What is something that might make a difference in easing the escalating tensions in the Middle East?
Well, we're seeing all manner of politicians all around the world calling for diplomacy, de-escalation dialogue. And I think that's right and proper. New Zealand has done the same. But it's how you get there. And the fact is that Iran was in negotiation before the weekend's events, and then the US went in there and bombed it. And how would you feel if you're Iran? How would you feel if you're Oman, the Gulf state that was brokering those talks between the United States and Iran? Oman has condemned the United States for what it did over the weekend. And it's difficult to disagree with them on that. And I think perhaps now is the time for New Zealand and others to be speaking out even more strongly against the United States here, and even going as far as to condemn the strikes, or at least to speak out in stronger terms, because New Zealand has avoided condemning the strikes as such. And I think New Zealand should, because in the end this was a breach of international law. It went against the UN Charter. The US strikes were not authorised in the US's own Congress. This was a deeply irresponsible action, and it will have grave consequences for the wider region, for the wider Middle East, and for the world. And I just don't think we know what the scale of those consequences will be yet.
As you say, New Zealand hasn't condemned the strikes as yet. What do you think is some of the reason that they haven't gone that far?
Well, I think New Zealand is very much looking at what Australia is doing and what European countries are doing, and it's taking its cues from them. And that's the way New Zealand foreign policy seems to work at the moment. We've left behind the independent foreign policy approach. And if you recall, in 2003, New Zealand didn't support the war in Iraq, and New Zealand parted company from Australia, which was one of the backers of the US's war in Iraq. This time around, New Zealand is almost copying and pasting from what Australia is doing, what other European countries are doing, and none of them are going there. None of them are condemning the United States for this. They're all saying Iran can't be allowed to have nuclear weapons and Iran should go back to the negotiating table, which just seems extraordinary to me, given that Iran, as I said earlier, was at the negotiating table before Israel and the United States wanted to take this into their own hands and to bomb Iran. So, look, in the end, this situation is just getting out of hand. We've gone from bad to worse since October the 7th. And, it's difficult to see a light at the end of the tunnel. But I think New Zealand needs to be speaking up strongly. This is the week to do that. Christopher Luxon is at NATO in The Hague this week. He is going to be there with all the world leaders, Donald Trump, Keir Starmer from the UK, Emmanuel Macron, the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz. Now is the time to speak up and stand up and say that New Zealand just doesn't find this acceptable, what the United States has done, what Israel has done, and it puts the whole world in grave danger. So now is the time to speak up and be counted, I think.
Tēnā koe, thank you for joining me. That is Geoffrey Miller, a geopolitical analyst and someone who is also researching his PhD on New Zealand's relations with the Gulf states.